Hello, everybody. Welcome to this evening's session. The webinar tonight we'll be talking about is we're talking about biodiversity. I'll give it just one more minute for a few people who might be late, and we can make a start. Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Willis. I'm the Integration Manager for the Western Vic Transmission Line Project. Tonight we're here to hear from a specialist who completed the biodiversity study for the project, and he's going to talk a bit about the scoping requirements and the existing conditions work that he's done. It's important to note that he's not in a position to discuss the impacts of the project, as the proposed route is yet to be selected, and so the impact assessment portion of the study has not been completed. But before we get into the formal proceedings for tonight, I would like to acknowledge the various traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today and pay respects to elders past and present, and also acknowledge those Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders with us here today.
Sorry, Michael, could you just reshare your screen? We're not seeing the presentation. Oh, there we go. There it is. Thanks.
Thanks. Today, we are going to hear a talk that covers the scoping requirements for the biodiversity studies. The scoping requirements are what DELP has considered the key issues to be considered in this area for the study. We're going to talk a bit about the community contributions to the study. We're going to hear about the threatened ecological communities, and we're going to hear a bit about biodiversity risks and values and the key ecological assessments that will be completed and the next steps for the study. And we will finish off with the question and answer session, which we're aiming to be about half the time, so everyone gets a good chance to ask questions and have them answered. By way of a bit of housekeeping, because this is a webinar and there are quite a number of participants, it's set up so that people are muted just because talking over each other doesn't work. We need to be clear that offensive language and personal attacks will not be tolerated through the webinar. We will attempt to answer as many questions as we possibly can in the time we've got, but it may not be possible to answer them all. And please put your questions directly into the chat at the bottom of the screen, and we will put them throughout and we will ask them in the second half of the session. Any questions that we don't get to, we'll use them to update the frequently asked questions on the website, and you can also book in for one of the sessions that we have coming in October, where you'll be able to meet one-on-one with different specialists to ask more detailed questions. So if you have further questions after this, I encourage you to book in to one of the sessions. Lastly, just to say we're hoping to finish by 8:30 today, and we'll try and manage time accordingly. Very briefly, I want to talk through where we are in the project. We are, let's call it midway through the planning approvals process and the EES. The existing conditions report have been submitted to the technical reference group that oversees the project, and the existing conditions work is the first half of the studies that are done. The following half is the impact assessment phase, and so today we're here to share those existing conditions findings. As I referenced earlier, we're not in a position to talk about the potential impacts at this stage, but we'll be able to. That'll be later in the project. We'll be able to talk through that. I will now hand over to our biodiversity specialist, who's a senior ecologist on the project.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Assume everyone can hear me and you can see my screen.
We can hear you, but we can't see the screen yet.
Just 1 second.
If you're having issues, I can share the presentation.
No, I think I've. There we go. Sorry about that. All right, is that coming through now?
No, it is unfortunately not coming through now. We can now see your desktop. If you put it to full screen sharing mode there.
Okay.
Fantastic, thank you.
Sorry about that. I'm a new Zoom user. Okay, so as Michael said, this is just presenting the existing conditions work that's been done to date for the project. So just quickly, this is the existing conditions report for the area of interest, which is the large study area that we started with. It's a requirement of the environmental effects statement. Basically, it sets the picture for the project. It allows everyone who's involved in assessing the project to have an understanding of the nature of the environment in which the project area is located within, so they can do their assessment. We are undertaking field work as we speak for the project, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in the presentation, but this existing conditions report is by and large using existing data to inform the conditions of the area of interest. There is obviously a publicly available corridor at the moment, so I will provide context to that where I can. And as Mike said, I'm not going to impact assessment at this stage because we don't have that information to share. So very quickly, the existing conditions requirements that come out of the ES scoping document that DELP has provided. Just wants to have an outline of the threatened ecological communities. So those are EPBC and FFG listed communities, listed threatened flora and threatened fauna that are relevant to the area, an understanding of biodiversity movement corridors that are within the area of interest. We will be doing a collision risk assessment, but we're not going into that tonight. That's part of the assessment. And then just sort of providing an understanding of the distribution of various aspects of biodiversity, native vegetation, habitat areas, those sorts of things. We have provided that information for a variety of corridors that were assessed to get to this point. And some of the information provided is relevant to some of the corridors that are no longer at play. We are looking at groundwater dependent ecosystems and where biodiversity relates, or where biodiversity relates to the GDE areas within the area of interest. We will be talking about the protected area state, but not tonight. And then also the other things we will be documenting as part of this assessment is planted and recovered vegetation, and where biodiversity values that may be outside the corridor but are impacted by the project are also captured for the assessment. So I imagine most of you have provided some data to the project So there's been a community consultation process for capturing information out there. There's a lot of people in the community that know a lot about the local biodiversity. This is just an example of some of the things that we've been provided with. There's many hundreds of specific observations that we've been provided with. They talk about things like the importance of hollow-bearing trees, importance for riparian corridors, and the biolinks that are in the landscape. Just very specific threatened species locations like the Brisbane Ranges grevillea, black cockatoo nesting locations, and little eagle and wedge-tailed eagle observations. So it's all very helpful in helping us contextualise the values that are in the landscape and make sure they're adequately assessed for the project. So just to quickly provide an overview, the area of interest for which the existing conditions report has been prepared is the larger shape there. As you all know, the corridor, which is now being looked at, has been provided to the community, but this existing conditions report as the first step in the process has been prepared for the area of interest. So this is just looking at the bioregions through which the project goes. So we generally talk west to east for the project. So we start in the Goldfields bioregion in the western extent where the existing or the Bulgana terminal station is located, and an alignment that will follow the existing 220 kV line that's already there, which comes across the Goldfields bioregion through the central Victorian uplands and back onto the Goldfields region before it gets onto the volcanic plain. So the bioregions all have a very distinct geological underlying character that influences the type of vegetation that occurs, and the type of vegetation influences the type of habitat. So there's very distinct groups of flora and fauna that occur throughout the corridor. From the central volcanic plain, which is around the Creswick Plain, if you like, the corridor opens up because it's there is no existing infrastructure there. So that's where it's been planned. So a lot of this information is going into picking a good route from a biodiversity point of view amongst all the other specialist areas that are being considered. So yeah, from the Creswick Plain, which is also the volcanic plain, it goes back up onto the central Victorian uplands and then back down onto the volcanic plain west of Melbourne. So the threatened ecological communities, so these are specific vegetation types that have been listed as threatened because of the limited remaining extent that is apparent in the landscape. So these are nationally protected communities. So these all occur within the area of interest. So grassy eucalypt woodlands, which is critically endangered, it's relevant to some of the southern options that were being looked at. It doesn't occur in the current corridor. Grey box grassy woodlands and dry grasslands does occur in the corridor around the Miramu and Loderderg vicinity. Obviously, we've got natural temperate grasslands that are on the volcanic plain. They're mainly west of Melbourne in the eastern extent of the project area. There are some smaller remaining remnants in the landscape around Creswick, generally in roadside reserves and travelling stock routes. There's seasonal herbaceous wetlands. So there's a very specific type of wetland that occurs in shallow depressions, and they only fill up after rain, and they have an abundant or very specific, I should say, life forms that come up when they're flooded, and they're specifically not connected to waterways. That's one of their defining characters. And then the last one there is the white box, yellow box, Blakely's red gum grassy woodland. And that one tends to occur in the very western end of the project area. But these have been recorded, as I said, so these are just some examples of what we've picked up in doing the field work to date. So it's a grey box, grassy woodland, as I said, around Miramu, That's some very high quality natural temperate grasslands. That's in a travelling stock route northwest of Ballarat, with the various grasses and herbs and forbs that make up that community. This is an example of a possible seasonal herbaceous wetlands. They're very hard to assess because you have to be there after they they've been inundated for a period of time, usually in early spring. The project has flown some LiDAR data, which is basically aerially sourced radar imagery, which provides an amazing understanding of landscape topography. So we're using that information specifically in this context, where you can see there's obviously a depression, and it's not connected to the adjoining waterway. So that's an area where we would suggest seasonal herbaceous wetlands is likely to occur. That's an example of some grassy woodlands in the distance there. So that's sort of south of Exford, which is out of the alignment, or out of the corridor, sorry, that we're looking at the moment. And some examples of the white box, yellow box grassy woodlands, generally restricted to roadside corridors in the far west. So just to provide what's been happening in the field, we have, this is just a part of the corridor on the volcanic plain, just to show you some of the things we've been finding. So a lot of the grassland area is either cropped, as you can see on the right here, and the majority of the areas that have not been cropped, which we're using LiDAR to help detect, is very heavily weed infested. So all the lovely artichoke thistle and serrated tussock species in that photo. A lot of the waterways along the volcanic plain are heavily incised, meaning that they've eroded down. So where the riparian vegetation remains, a lot of that is going to not be impacted by the project, but we're mapping it all the same. So it's part of the assessment. That will be dealt with, and obviously when we get into the impact assessment, we're picking up large old trees as part of the native vegetation assessment, and a lot of those are also considered to be avoidable by the project. They're outside the exclusion zone of when we establish the conductor height above the landscape. We're also picking up different sorts of grasslands. So some grasslands meet the criteria to be EPBC listed, and that criteria is basically 50% cover of native perennial grasses. Then other grasslands which only have a 25% cover, they will be defined as an ecological vegetation class, which is fancy terminology used in Victoria to talk about native vegetation. And some of that grassland vegetation also then specific habitat for some of the threatened species. So in this case, this was picked up as striped legless lizard habitat. So that's been mapped in some of those areas. We've got targeted surveys set up, which are using tile grids to see if we can locate the species. So all of this information, all of this mapping that we're doing at this stage is feeding in to help the design. And as I said earlier, all the specialists from all the disciplines are collating, what is important, and that all has to be fed into the design, and they're all constraints. So just some examples of some of the threatened flora we've located to date. So we've got the Bacchus marsh wattle, which is very specific around the long forest Miramu part of the world. We've got some of the cowslip orchids, bull oak, the yarragum, spiny rice flower, the basalt peppercress, the brittle greenhood, and sun orchid that it hasn't popped out yet, so we can't tell. So these are just examples of some of the threatened flora we've found. generally speaking, the threatened flora is in pretty high quality habitats. A lot of the threatened flora that's listed tends to be associated with the native grasslands. It's just that grasslands have been subject to a high degree of disturbance and modification. Therefore, grasslands are protected as a community, and many of the species that make up the grassland are also threatened because there's so little habitat remaining. So this is a map of existing data that's providing threatened flora locations throughout the AOI. As I said, a lot of the threatened plant species are specifically associated with the grassland areas. So a lot of that was the Western Plains of Melbourne and Melton that it's been eaten up by subdivision. And then that's to a lesser degree around Creswick, where a lot of agriculture has removed habitat. And as the example I showed earlier, the roadside vegetation is where some of those species remain. This is not to say that threatened species are not going to be found in other areas. Obviously, we've got a process of identifying habitat and we're out looking, but this is just where species have previously been recorded. So that helps guide our assessment, helps us understand where we should be looking, the type of habitat these species are associated with, and where we should be targeting our investigations. So threatened fauna that we've found in the investigation area, we have located the golden sun moth. At this stage, we've located 7 sites in the western end of the area of interest, so in the west of Lexington. We've got some tree goannas around Miramu, bearded dragon. There's our striped legless lizard that we are currently searching for. We have located it elsewhere in the AOI. And we have deployed a lot of remote cameras in relevant habitats. So we've picked up some brush-tailed phascogales at a few sites. And that's a southern booble. It's not threatened, but it's an owl, and owls are pretty cool. So these are a series of maps just to, again, demonstrate where various threatened fauna groups are located. So this is a map of threatened wetland birds, just to start with. So the blue areas are DELP mapped wetlands that we use to understand where wetland locations are. And there's a habitat for a bunch of threatened bird species that are very specifically associated with wetlands. Brolgas, bitterns, hardheads, they're all part of the threatened species that we need to be providing a detailed understanding for this project. But in this case, just generally speaking, the project's corridor is skirting the very northern outskirts of the large volcanic plain wetland area. Skipton here to the southwest, and the sort of flat volcanic plain and the wetlands there is where the bulk of the wetland bird species that have been subject to a great deal of assessment associated with all the wind farms that have gone in out there. So there's a huge extent of the wetlands are sort of to the southwest. We're skirting right on the edge of the bioregion, which I talked about earlier. We're sort of skirting the edge of the central Victorian uplands off the volcanic plain. There's a suite of fauna species specifically associated with grasslands. Golden sun moth and striped legless lizards are 2 kind of classic examples of grassland specialists. I mean, the reason a striped legless lizard has no legs is it's evolved to live in tussock grassland area, and the light blue dots are where that has been previously located. So we're establishing where it could be located within the corridor and where surveys may need to happen. Or conversely, if we can establish where the habitat areas are, where they can be avoided by any specific disturbance that would impact the species. That's the same for what we loosely grouped together as the woodland fauna. So this has helped, again, guide where we've been doing surveys. So the brush-tailed phascogale, which the remote camera pictures I showed a second ago, well known across the sort of the southern Lerderderg wombat forest area. The a well-established greater glider population in the bottom of Wombat. And those are some of the species that we've been specifically targeting with our assessments, fieldwork assessments that we've undertaken to date. This is a complicated image, but let me just try and walk you through it. This is, we're using Bird Life Australia data to sort of help us provide a very comprehensive understanding of the bird utilisation within the study area. The reason we're doing that is that the Bird Life Australia data brings together qualified data from hundreds of ornithologists running around the landscape, which is a data set well beyond anything that we could achieve by just doing the assessment ourselves. So it's a great data set. This is specifically for a FFG, that's the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act. It's a threatened woodland bird community. So that's a community of bird species. I think it's about 23 birds off the top of my head that define that community. So this is a 22-year time scale or a window with the records, so we can just see what are the important habitat areas for that specific suite of birds within the landscape that we're interested in at the moment. So it starts to show some hotspots in the landscape, and the Long Forest, Lerderderg area, the Creswick Regional Park, Mount Beckworth, and the Ben Major Lexington bushland areas were very quickly identified as hotspots. This doesn't have the corridor on it, unfortunately, but if you just can remember, that sort of skirted across the top there. So we're not going near the Ensbury grey box forest, which is a very important bird area, or the Brisbane Ranges here. And obviously swift parrots are an important species. And again, this brings the data set from the BirdLife Australia and the VBA. So I think there's about 680 individual records from BirdLife Australia from 72 surveys. And it provides a comprehensive understanding of how swift parrots move through the landscape. So I'm sure you all know that swift parrots breed in Tasmania, in the northeast, in the tall wood forests down there. For some reason, they decided to fly up to the box ironbark forest of central Victoria as for their winter feeding grounds. So every year they fly up and then fly back. So the box ironbark forests are a little bit further to the north outside of the project area. So that's the critical habitat for the species that then move through. And because they're very reliant on the winter or the early winter, then late winter flowering eucalypts, the grey boxes as a species that they're very keen on, along with the yellow gum. And then you can see they're very regularly recorded as they come up through the Brisbane Ranges, and the Ensbury grey box forest is an island as they sort of tend to funnel up through Long Forest. Now that does change. These are the common records. So most years that's where they go. Some years when it's particularly dry, we know they go to the east and sometimes go up the coast. And in other years, they will go sort of further west and move around sort of through that part of the alignment. But I think, every year, the pretty much entire swift parrot population moves up and down through this part of the world. So just some of the examples of what we're looking for when we're out doing field work, and why field work's very important to be able to articulate or understand some of the issues out there. So these are just some pictures the field team's been able to grab whilst doing their work. So yeah, tree hollows are very important. So obviously that's something we're looking for in defining the quality of the vegetation or the habitat we're finding. Wedge-tailed eagles and little eagles were well known in the area, and then many of the community feedback or the pins that have been provided to us are definitely associated with those raptors. And it's they're well understood in the landscape. And then when we're trying to target some of the specific areas, we're looking for these threatened species. So this is an example of brittle greenhood habitat. So that's the orchid I showed you a picture of earlier. It only occurs in these grey box woodlands, and it really seems to only occur where there's a nice mossy layer, an open part of that woodland area. Excuse me. So there are other areas that meet the potential habitat criteria in that they're a grey box forest, but in this case, it's been disturbed and it has a layer of weed. So this is oxalis, which is pretty much just smothering out that important moss bed, which the orchid seems to be kind of reliant upon to grow. So we're able to sort of categorize significance of habitat and also where to target specific assessments to locate these features in the wild. And as I said, that's very important to assess the project and also help guide design to minimise impact. Now, this is just another really interesting data set that DELP has. It's called NatureKit. Anyone can look this up on the internet. It's I use it every day. It's an amazing piece of computer assisted intelligence that anyone interested in the environment. There's just so much in here. So this is NatureKit version 2.0, and this is a habitat importance layer. So these are just an amalgam of all biodiversity values, be it the quality of the vegetation, the presence of threatened species habitat. So this helps contextualize where important biodiversity features are in the landscape. So the darker the green, the more higher the value. I guess the flip side of that is it's also helping identify areas that could do with a little bit of investment in perhaps improving the situation, which are the paler coloured areas. So this is the corridor that's publicly released that we're looking at now. So again, we've used this to help again guide our assessments. So a couple of important areas of remnant vegetation about between Mount Cole and the Glen Lofty Ranges. So obviously that's a very important habitat linkage area. Not that the vegetation is necessarily linking those two areas, but they're in close proximity, and there's a lot of scattered paddock trees and small patches of vegetation in that part of the world. Around the Lexton area, there's the Lexton Bushland Reserves and a sort of large area of remnant vegetation. It's some of it's grazed, some of it's managed by Parks Victoria, but it does provide a very important refuge in that part of the world. So we've done a lot of survey through there, and we've picked up the phascogales, we've picked up the owls, some orchids. So that was focus there. And then as we moved east, we have the Hepburn Lagoon, which is a important wetland area, number of bird records. We have what we have been referring to as the Wombat South Forest, so that's outside the state forest. It's an area of bushland that has, again, connectivity down towards the Brisbane Ranges and down the Moorabool River area. We have the Loderderg Park and the Long Forest nature conservation areas, which are both important linkage corridors through the landscape here. So quickly touch on groundwater dependent ecosystems. That's again something that DELP has required us to have a look at. Groundwater dependent ecosystems are a fairly topical ecological feature that we've done a lot of work on in the last, let's say, 5 or 10 years. We're involved in writing the Atlas, which is on the Bureau of Meteorology website. I'm not sure why it lives there, but it does. So a GDE is a groundwater dependent ecosystem. So that's a habitat or an ecological system that to some degree relies on groundwater for its maintenance. So this became important, obviously, as groundwater management suddenly was considered an important aspect of water management, that their features, natural features in landscape would depend upon them. So unfortunately, I haven't got the corridor here, but if we use our imaginations, we're sort of following between the Pyrenees and the Mount Cole area through the middle there. So in that part of the world, a lot of the drainage lines have a base flow that has some groundwater linkage. So particularly during dry phases, they become important drought refuge features in the landscape. So it's pretty much just restricted to the drainage lines. As we move east off the central Victorian uplands, so again, this is where bioregions and the geology have a major influence on pretty much everything. Moving down onto the volcanic plain, we have a lot of the wetland systems. That's what I was alluding to before around south of Skipton. There's all your major wetland systems, but we're up here and there are some wetland systems that do have some sort of moderate to low groundwater influence. That's largely around recharge and, again, maintaining drought refuges in dry time. And then that's just providing a little bit of a snapshot into that part of the world to the northwest of Creswick, which the corridor moves through. All right, so that's just a very broad overview of the data we've brought together to contextualise the environment the AOI sits in. So just to provide some information on that we are out there doing surveys. We're out pretty much every day at the moment. So it's just some examples of what we've been finding. So we have done targeted surveys for these issues on the left here. So we've done greater glider surveys in the areas where we have identified potential habitat. We've completed the greater glider surveys now. We have undertaken golden sun moth surveys in the west. The golden sun moth survey season is about to start. Just waiting for the soil temperature to warm up a bit, and probably within maybe the next 4 to 6 weeks, I reckon that'll happen. And about the same time, probably because striped legless lizards like to feed on golden sun moths, and they occur in the same habitat. Striped legless lizards come out of the cracks in the clay and are active for a few months when it's quite warm before they then disappear back into the soil for the other 9 months of the year. We've used our remote cameras in several of the important habitat areas I mentioned for boreal mammal surveys. So I showed you the phascogales before. This is a glider. We've picked up I think it's a sugar glider. We've picked up the feather tail glider as well. I think it's probably just landed, a bit of a blurry image. We've completed owl surveys in relevant habitat. So we're looking for masked owl, powerful owl, and these are some ecologists out either doing, I think this was doing glow glider surveys. We're about to start bat surveys, so we use a special piece of kit called an anabat recorder, which is an ultrasonic microphone, so it only picks up the high frequency calls that bats make. We've done ground grass hog surveys in some of the areas that were considered for the terminal station. We're trying to undertake some seasonal flora surveys now, and we're doing the native veg assessments. So again, yeah, just to finish up, that's the assessments we're progressing at the moment. So it's a fieldwork program that we're using to inform the design and the assessment of the project. That information gets provided to DELP to undertake the approvals. We're recording all the native vegetation for both trying to avoid and minimise any impacts, but then also the final offset requirement for anything that's unavoidable. And yeah, any significant impacts to EPBC species will be determined as well. And we report all that, so the process of bringing that all together. So yeah, that's what we've been up to.
Great, thank you very much.
Stop sharing.
That sounds great. Yep. Thank you very much for that. That's fantastic. We've had a number of questions come rolling in now. The first one I can provide an answer to. So Anne has asked the question, if you haven't finalised the corridor, why are you focused only on one corridor? Telling us that this is not finalised is very misleading. In answer to your question, Anne, we haven't finalised the proposed route yet, but the route occurs within this corridor. So a corridor is broader than a route, and we're doing the work to refine down within that broader area where the final route will go. We have a question from Moira about why is long forest important for fauna?
Why is long forest important for fauna? Yep. It's there. So it's been preserved for a long period of time. And it's connected in with Lerderderg and the Pyrenees forest above it. So it's got a number of different habitat types, I suppose, in such a small area. So each habitat type has a suite of species that are associated with it. So because you've got so many different habitat types in a small area, you have such a range of species recorded there. There's also been survey. I mean, the University of Melbourne started its first sort of natural history courses, and that's where they went to study. So there's also a wealth of data for that part of the world.
Great, thanks very much. We've got a question from Maria. She's asked, in the surveys, have you found anything surprising?
Have we found anything surprising? Not yet. I mean, it's all. I don't mean to sound like I take my job for granted. We get to walk around the bush and look at interesting stuff all day. So I think just seeing nature change over the course of the year. So the mass emergence we're having at the moment. I think as far as anything peculiar with the golden sun moth, we've now got we've established records much further west than it was previously thought to occur. So that was surprising. But yeah, just I think orchids particularly, I'm a plant guy, so the number of different orchids that were popping up through the early phase of spring is very interesting.
Great, thank you. Darren's asked, have you investigated the biolinks planted by landcare groups?
We've had a look, so we're talking with the CMAs at the moment and getting actual mapping of all the corridor plant, or basically all environmental plantings that have been undertaken throughout the area. So we've got some good information from some of the groups that have supplied that to us directly, and then the CMAs have also been very helpful in providing that locations of those undertakings. And again, that's part of the scoping documentation, so that also goes into understanding, best locations to consider for the design.
Okay, sounds good. Frank has asked the question, what do you do when you find a rare species?
What do we do when we find a rare species? We take lots of photos. We don't use invasive trapping. So ours, we rely, we haven't had our Elliott traps out for years now. We don't use harp nets anymore. So we try not to interfere with the plants or animals at all. So obviously a remote camera allows us to stay home and not have to run around in the cold, wet evenings. And we get an amazing data set of all sorts of interesting, sometimes peculiar things that go on in the bush at night. So so basically we don't harm, there's no harm, and greatest respect to the species we find.
Sounds good, thanks. I have another question from Darren. I'm going to get the name of this, pronounce it poorly, but I'm going to try for entertainment value. It's called Phytophthora cinnamonoic, or cinnamon fungus, is known
Very
to
close.
occur within the Lodeberg State Park and the Wombat State Forest. Have you conducted studies to determine where they occur?
So DELP maintains a very good data set of those. So it's in the Brisbane Ranges as well. So yeah, that's a very nasty slime mold that attacks in the sand, particularly the alkaline sandy soils. So usually where you have, very generally speaking, where you have grass trees, it's usually an indicator that's an area that could be impacted by Phytophthora. And so that will be mapped, and that's part of the biosecurity aspect of project management. But that then also is very important with planning the environmental management plan that ensures any material, any machinery is all managed to ensure that horrible thing isn't spread.
Good one, okay. We're getting quite a few questions that relate to the impact assessment, which, as we talked about earlier, it's not something that we can cover today. Moira and Frank, my apologies. I suggest you make a time in the one-on-one sessions happening, and more information will be coming out over time, but it's not something we can address today.
Michael, it's probably important to remind people that we won't be able to really talk about impact assessment in the one-on-one sessions either. It's the same. It's basically if you have any specific questions on the existing condition, or if you've got some interesting information that you want to share, but the one-on-one sessions we just can't do impact assessment with you. Yes.
Okay. So for people who want to know, when will information about the impact assessment be made available publicly? At what stage in the process?
That's a good question.
It's likely to be at the when the entire EES is made public, prior to the appointed panel being taking submissions. So everyone will get a chance to read the entire document when it becomes public. But until that stage, the consolidated impact assessment it isn't something we can share. We have a question from George. He's asked, how do you look for species that are hard to find?
That's a great question. And there are a number of species in this part of the world that we call cryptic, in that they only respond to very specific environmental conditions. That can be a community like the seasonal herbaceous wetlands I mentioned earlier that respond to flooding events. So we do a lot of research, and I guess this is exactly why we do the existing conditions report, how we've done it, it's collating a lot of data around what people have found over the years in this landscape, and then it's contextualizing what the habitats are for the species where they have been found, so we know where to look for them in other areas. So there's a lot of literature available. It talks about, for plants, it's the obviously it's the flowering time when they're most obvious in the landscape, and that's usually when we try to target our surveys. And there's a range. Orchids are probably the classic example, that there's a whole bunch of different orchids that come up throughout the sort of very late winter, early spring time of the year. In fact, the Wurundjeri have 6 seasons, and the season that we've just finished is actually called the orchid season. I won't embarrass myself by trying to pronounce the name, but it's so doing a lot of research and categorizing the landscape. We've got the LiDAR imagery, which I touched on before, which gives you this amazing understanding of land use history, where the land has been previously ploughed or disturbed or undisturbed. There's a great deal of information on that Nature Kit website that I mentioned. And then we have a team of passionate ecologists that spend a lot of time professionally and for fun looking into this sort of stuff.
Great. Okay, thanks. The next question actually comes from Darren as well. Did you investigate the new nature reserve that the Vic government announced over Loderderg River that blocks the entire corridor north of Darley? The government announcement in relation to this reserve accepted the recommendation that transmission lines are not sited in or over nature reserves.
That's probably not a biodiversity specific issue. That's probably more of a land use. So I guess the long and short is trying to say it is, well, we've clocked that. It's probably not something that the biodiversity team is specifically looking at. We're obviously looking at the natural elements that make up the landscape, not overlays or property tenure or things like that. But that's still an important part of the project. Don't get me wrong. That's being looked at by other specialists.
Okay. Thanks. Steve has asked, why can't the surveys be done on public land so that you don't have to disturb our farming and animals?
Public. So there's very few surveys that are probably happening in paddocks that are occupied by livestock, because the things we're looking for often disappear from the productive landscape. So as soon as you start using fertilizers or grazing, a lot of the threatened flora species and fauna species disappear. Generally, sometimes if you've maintained a native grassland cover, in some situations even tussocked, like serrated tussock can be a habitat for golden sun moth and striped legless lizard, which is kind of weird, but they're associated with the soils where the weeds have grown on top of where they've maintained habitat. But by and large, we're not really, we do a preliminary assessment on areas where we can't exclude the potential for native grasslands, but by and large, if an area's being grazed or cropped, we wouldn't really have that many things would be interested there.
Okay. Frank has asked another question. What do you expect to find in heavily cropped land?
Crops.
Right.
So yeah, again, we would exclude. So we have a whole lot of criteria we use to obviously it's a huge area. So we have had to really target our assessment to the areas where we think things are going to occur. So an area that's been cropped would have pretty low likelihood of retaining anything we're interested in. So as I said, other than some unimproved native pasture, I I couldn't imagine why we'd be looking at anything in the cropped area.
Okay. John has asked the question, what happens if you don't find a particular plant or animal? Do you assume that it's not there?
Not necessarily. Ecologists often say when you can only prove something is present when you see it at a particular time. If the habitat meets all, so there's a whole criteria to identify what is useful habitat to a specific species. So greater glider, as an example, so we didn't locate the greater glider in the area where we were looking for it, but that is, it meets the habitat definition and it's connected to other areas where we know they occur. So we would still regard that as potential habitat, although it's not, we didn't locate the species. So it's not just presence or absence. There's a whole lot of to contextualize what a particular area has in terms of the provision of relevant habitat. So, and scoping document also clearly requested that it wasn't just locating the species, it was also locating habitat. So that's an important consideration in its own right.
Okay, thanks. A follow-up question to Darren's question before about the new nature reserve. Can you tell us if you did survey the new nature reserve?
The
one announced by the Victorian government?
No, we have not.
Have not, okay. And we're getting close on time, so we'll try and get through the last few here. Why are you relying on data sets and not what you find in the field?
That's our first step. So again, because it's such a large area, that's what informed our survey approach. So yeah, as I said, we're out. I've got the team out in the field pretty much every day at the moment doing the survey. So obviously there's a lot of work in doing the surveys, and there's a lot of work bringing that data together to report. So we're not in a position to do that yet. So that will come, but this helps provide the context. As I said at the start, for people who are involved in the project who don't understand this part of, or don't have a local knowledge, and it also is the first step in how we approach an assessment. We're talking about 195,000 hectare area of interest. So we started it with an enormous parcel of land. So most ecological surveys work we do is you can consider in football field sized units of land. So this is I'm not even going to guess how many football fields, but it's a lot. So that's just how we have to start a process like this. So we've got the right information and the right understanding to guide our further assessment work.
Okay, thanks. And we might try and squeeze.
First, I'll just quickly add to the bird data. As I said, even if I put 100 ecologists out for 2 years, we're not going to get anywhere near the type of data that's available from BirdLife Australia that has like literally thousands of ornithologists out looking.
It's lucky that you've got that resource to tap into. Just lastly, a quick one before we wrap up. Scott's asked, what is the VBA? We look for the swift parrots through here every year.
So the VBA is the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas. So it's an amazing resource that DELP manage. So it's a database of basically every ecologist that's working in Victoria. We have to have a permit. Part of our permit condition is that we supply all of the information that we gather back to DELP, so that they're developing this ever-growing database of the species and where they occur in Victoria. It's a really incredible piece of data, but anyone can access it. So it's if you go to DELP, or if you Google Victorian Biodiversity Atlas, it'll take you straight there. It's not that hard to negotiate or understand how to make it operate, but you can basically put in a point anywhere, set what area you want to look at, and it'll give you every record of flora and fauna that's been previously located there.
Great, thank you very much. Right, well, we've run out of time. I would like to thank everybody for their active participation and the questions you put forward. We'll invite you to complete a quick survey afterwards in the hope that we can improve these based on feedback. I'd encourage everybody to book in for the one-on-ones if they'd like to talk about some of the detail of the existing conditions reports with a specialist in more detail in October. And as always, if you'd like to have any questions for the project, email through to the project email address there, and there's a phone number on the website as well. Just quickly before I go, we certainly acknowledge that projects like this create a level of uncertainty and concern for communities and landowners in which they're based, and we're keen to make sure that people have an avenue to reach out should they need further support in this area. And we've partnered up with a number of organisations that are entirely independent to us, and their services are anonymous, and that we're keen to offer these up for people who are finding times hard at the moment. There's full information here, and it's available on our website as well. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming along today. This concludes the webinar. There will be a series of future webinars coming up this week and next week as well. Please come along and hear from other specialists on other topics. Thanks so much for coming today. Take care.
Thank you.